My name's Ethan, and I was 16 years old when this took place. It was back in 2003, so you can figure out how old I am now if you'd like. It was a regular summer afternoon, and I had just gotten back from school. I headed straight to the basement, where I was deeply into playing Age of Empires, my favorite computer game at the time. Actually, I still play it sometimes. Even now, I had been at it for maybe 40 minutes, completely lost in the game, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I figured it was my mom returning from her job. A few moments later, I caught the sound of someone stepping onto the porch, which was located directly above the basement. Then I heard the screen door open, but strangely the main door didn't. Curious about what was happening, I decided to head upstairs and take a look. As I climbed the stairs, faint voices reached me from the backyard. Peeking through the curtains, I noticed two men standing there quietly talking and glancing toward the windows. At first I assumed they might be acquaintances of my older sister, but then I realized they were complete strangers. They were too old to be friends with either of us, at least 26 or 27. One of them was on the heavier side, wearing a blue hoodie, while the other was an average build, dressed in a plain black t-shirt. Both had short, scruffy beards. As one of them walked past a different window, a chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I tried to think of a logical reason for their presence, but nothing made sense. My parents never scheduled repairs or visits like this without letting me know, especially when I was alone. Realizing the situation might escalate, I knew I had to act quickly. I moved to the back door and cautiously peeked out through the curtains. The two men were still there, shifting around and looking uneasy. Then one of them tried to turn the handle of the back door. Thankfully it was locked. He jiggled it twice and then gave the door a hard thump, almost like he was venting his frustration. I grabbed my phone and tried to be as quiet as possible, since I didn't think they knew I was inside. I called my mom at work, and as soon as I told her what was happening, she called the police and told me to stay put. I tried to remain calm, but I could hear the men outside moving from window to window, figuring it would be safer to hide. I slipped into my closet and remained as silent as I could for what seemed like an eternity. After 10 or so nerve-wracking minutes, I finally heard the sirens. I was afraid the men were going to break a window, but they didn't, so I assumed they were worried about making too much noise that might alert someone. As the noise got closer, I heard loud shouts outside telling the men to get down and raised their hands as they left my hiding place. I cautiously looked out my bedroom window, but couldn't see much, so I moved to my sister's room for a better view. I was fortunate that these men took their time checking doors instead of forcing their way in right away, because that delay gave me the chance to call for help before things could get out of control. This happened quite a few years ago, so I apologize if some parts feel vague. I've buried this memory for reasons that will soon become clear, but I've realized that it's not something I should keep hidden. I saw the two men being handcuffed and led to a police car. The nightmare was over, and one of the officers stayed with me until my mom arrived home, which was only a short while later. About half an hour into the game, one of the players made a poor move, and Danny slammed his hand on the remote in frustration, accidentally turning off the TV. "What's your problem?" My brother Danny and I were hanging out in my room alone at home, watching a basketball game on TV. We were shouting at the screen whenever our team made a mistake. When I switched the TV back on, I remarked, but as soon as the screen loaded, we heard heavy, rapid footfall coming from below. Danny and I paused instantly, looking at the bedroom door. I turned down the TV level so I could hear it better. Danny replied in a trembling voice, "I think someone's in the house, but it's probably the cat." I tried to remain calm, but Danny wasn't taking any risks, so he got up and closed the door. I heard a click and realized that if someone had been inside, the noise may have revealed where we were. I tried to tell myself it was just the tabby cat, but more footsteps echoed. Danny mumbled, "That's not the cat," from below. His anxious countenance began to rub off on me, and I decided to take him seriously. We turned off the bedroom light, leaving the room in complete darkness. I knelt by the door and put my ear to it as Danny fumbled about for anything we might use as a weapon. Since the walls and door were thin, I assumed I would hear any sound coming from the other side, but initially there was just stillness. When I lay on my stomach and peered through the small opening beneath the door, I saw nothing at first. However, after concentrating more, I noticed a pair of scuffed work boots moving slowly down the hallway. My heart raced as I silently got back up and tiptoed over to Danny, whispering, "Someone's here." I thought Danny might faint, so I grabbed him and led him to the window. I slid it open quietly and looked down at the ground about a story below. Danny was still frozen, seemingly detached from reality, so it was up to me to act. I pried Danny's phone out of his hand. It had one of those fingerprint locks, and he put his thumb on the screen. The phone beeped loudly, and my stomach dropped as we heard footsteps racing toward the bedroom door. I quickly dialed 911 and swung one leg out the window. Suddenly, there was pounding on the door, followed by a deep, angry voice that yelled, "I'm going to get you." My heart almost stopped. I climbed out onto the porch roof and yelled for Danny to follow me. He snapped out of his daze, scrambled to the window, and climbed out. I whispered, "We need to jump." Danny hesitated on the edge of the roof, and I jumped, first landing awkwardly and twisting my ankle in pain. Then, I looked up and saw that Danny was making the sign of the cross on his chest before jumping. He hit the ground in a roll, got up, and rubbed his neck before I realized that our cat was still in my pocket. I told the 911 operator that we needed the police right away, and she reassured me that officers were on their way and told us to stay on the line. Tears welled up as we slowly made our way back toward the house, worried about what we would find. When the cops arrived, we sat on the curb, too shaken to do anything but wait. The officers searched the house, but were unable to find the intruder, so we were relieved, and brought out our cat Smokey, and I held him tightly. Although the police claimed there was no evidence of a break-in, no stolen property, and no indication that anyone had been there at all, I know what happened to us was real because I haven't slept well since that night, and now I always lock my door and keep Smokey in my room. I apologized in private for leaving him behind. Since my mom worked late shifts as a caregiver at an aged living home when I was younger, from 5:30 p.m. to 1:30 a.m., Danny placed security cameras around the house, and nothing comparable has occurred. She used to hire a babysitter for my younger brother Lucas and me, but once we were old enough we stayed home alone. We liked it because it made us feel independent and responsible. Neither of us was the type to cause trouble. We were actually pretty well behaved and good at school. We'd finish our homework without being told, then spend the rest of the evening watching TV or just relaxing. Our living room faced the street, and there was a large window near the television so we could see the sidewalk. and passing cars out of the corner of our eyes while watching. It was a calm night with only a few cars driving by and the occasional person walking. However, after a while I noticed something out. A blue minivan from the early 2000s passed by our house several times. I stopped paying attention to the show and focused on the street instead. After the van passed a few more times, I told Lucas about it. He hadn't noticed because he was engrossed in the program. We both sat there keeping an eye on the street, and sure enough, the van went by 2 more times in a span of just a few minutes. The van driving back and forth was strange, but we initially thought the driver might be lost. However, when it passed again multiple times, we began to feel uneasy. Both of us were glued to the window, but after a short while the van stopped coming, we were relieved and went back to watching TV. It was getting late, so Lucas and I decided it was time for bed. He headed upstairs, and I walked past the window to turn off the lights. That's when I saw something that made my heart race. The van was parked across the street from our house, just far enough out of view from where we had been sitting earlier. I quickly closed the curtains, but left a small gap to peek through. Inside the van, I saw a man sitting in the driver's seat. I wondered if he'd been there the entire time. It was hard to see him clearly, but one detail stood out: his eyes. They reflected the glow of the street lights, giving them a menacing, almost golden hue. I wasn't sure if he saw me behind the curtains, but he was definitely staring at our house. Panicking, I called Lucas downstairs. He looked out the window, spotted the man, and whispered, "I think he saw me." We were both terrified. After a brief discussion, we decided to call our mom at work. Normally, we prided ourselves on being independent and didn't want to disturb her. But this situation was different. As soon as we explained what was happening, she left work immediately and drove home. Less than 15 minutes later, we saw her car pull into the driveway. I looked back toward the street, but the van was gone. It must have left the moment my mom arrived. We never found out who the man was or what he wanted. My mom reported the incident to the police, but without a license plate number, there wasn't much they could do. The experience shook all of us, and for about a year afterward, my mom hired a babysitter again when she worked nights. My name is Alex, and this story is about one of the first times my parents left me home by myself. I was probably around 11 or 12 back then. They had started leaving me alone occasionally when I was about 9. Looking back, I realized that might be considered a bit young, but that's just how things were in my family. My mom had a strict rule: never answer the door or the phone when no one else was home. Of course, I didn't always follow the rules. Sometimes I'd pick up the phone, especially if I thought it might be one of my friends. I was watching TV in the living room at around 8 p.m. when the doorbell rang. At first, I ignored it and continued watching my show, but then curiosity got the better of me, so I got up and walked toward the front of the house. I didn't intend to open the door. I just wanted to sneak a peek through the window to see who it was. Missing a call from them felt like missing out at the time, because my dad was away on a work trip and my mom had gone out for something I can't quite recall. Standing, a man in his 40s was wearing what appeared to be a work uniform. He was wearing a blue shirt with a collar and a name tag, but I couldn't make out what it was. I was only observing him for a few seconds when he turned to face me. Our eyes locked, and I froze as he waved and said, "Hey kid, we got a report of a gas problem. Can you let me in?" My heart raced as I quickly closed the curtain and backed away from the window. I knew I wasn't supposed to open the door, but the idea of a gas problem sounded serious. Hesitating, I finally unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. The man was cheerful and polite. He explained that he needed to check the gas lines inside the house. I told him I wasn't supposed to let strangers in, but he then asked, "Can I speak with your mom or dad?" That's when I felt a chill run down my spine. It hit me that if I admitted I was alone, he could do whatever he wanted. He was probably trying to figure that out. As soon as I opened the door, panicking, I tried to come up with a lie. The best I could manage was to tell him that my dad was in the shower. I hoped that would buy me a little time. We stood there awkwardly for what felt like forever. The tension was unbearable, and I felt like I might cry. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw one of my neighbors across the street walking her dog. She spotted me on the porch with the man and must have sensed something was off. As soon as he noticed her heading our way, his demeanor changed. He turned, walked briskly back to a white van parked nearby, got in, and drove off without saying a word. My neighbor called out to me asking who that man was. I told her what had happened, that he claimed to be from the gas company and was checking for a leak. She stayed calm, but firmly told me to go back inside while she called my mom. I learned a valuable lesson. That night could have been much worse, and I'll never forget how terrifying it felt to be in that situation. My mom came home in a hurry, and when she heard what had happened, she called the police right away. Later, my mom called the gas company, and they confirmed that they hadn't sent anyone out and that there were no reports of a gas issue. We never found out who that man was or what he wanted, but that night could have been much worse. This incident occurred during Thanksgiving last year, and all of my housemates went home to celebrate with their families. I'm a 26-year-old woman who lived in a house with some of my old college friends. We had all graduated about 5 years prior, but fortunately we ended up working in the same city, so we decided to move in together. However, I have a tense relationship with my parents, so I remained home and had the whole house to myself. In addition, I wanted to go to a small business gathering at a local pub, where we had some drinks and spoke about work for a few hours at about 10 o'clock at night. I made the decision to go home early in order to unwind with Netflix and get into bed at a respectable hour. When the car arrived, I waited on the curb for it. I got into the back seat, and the driver, a bald man in his mid-40s, was friendly and chatty, even though I wasn't in the mood to talk. He asked me casual questions about my plans for the evening, and when I told him that I had been out with coworkers and that my housemates were away for Thanksgiving, he laughed awkwardly and said, "So you're home alone tonight?" He gave me a quick smile as he looked at me in the rearview mirror. My stomach dropped. I realized I'd made a mistake by telling a stranger I was alone and had already shared my home address. I tried to brush off the uneasy feeling, convincing myself he was probably harmless. When we reached my house, I thanked him and got out. After walking inside and locking the front door, I peeked out the window and felt a wave of relief as I watched the car drive away. I changed into my pajamas and settled into bed watching something on my laptop. That's when I heard a long, slow, creaking noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like a door being opened carefully. My heart sank as I realized I hadn't checked or locked the back door. I quickly shut my laptop, placing it on my nightstand, and stood by my bedroom door, straining to hear any sounds. A faint but unmistakable noise reached my ears. Footsteps moving around downstairs. Someone was inside the house. I panicked for a moment, but managed to keep myself composed. I moved my dresser in front of the door, hoping to barricade it. But the sound of footsteps grew louder and faster. My heart raced as I realized that blocking the door had likely revealed my location. I darted into the closet and whispered a call to 911. The operator reassured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay as calm as possible. They said it would only take a few minutes, but those minutes felt endless. Then I heard a pounding on my bedroom door. Whoever was on the other side was trying to break in. The dresser wouldn't hold for long. Desperate, I shouted that the police were on their way. To my relief, the noise stopped moments later. The sound of sirens filled the air. A few tense minutes passed before a female officer knocked on my door and assured me it was safe to come out. She explained they had apprehended the intruder. As I stepped outside, I told her about the unsettling interaction I'd had with my ride earlier. When we walked out to the street, I froze. Sitting in the back of a police car was the man who had driven me home. The same Uber driver. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't heard that creak from downstairs. It's terrifying to think about. If there's one lesson from this ordeal, it's this: never share too much with a stranger, especially if you're home alone. My name is Ethan and I live in what many believe to be a haunted house in Calgary, Alberta. My mom and sister were convinced of this long before I was. I used to doubt the idea of ghosts until something eerie happened to me. I'm 20 now, but this story takes place when I was 18 during the middle of July. Let me first share some of the strange things that occurred to my mom and sister before my own experience. Both my mom and sister had episodes of sleep paralysis in our house, something they had never experienced before moving here. They described it like this: they would wake up feeling like a heavy weight was pressing on their chests, as though someone was sitting on them. They were unable to speak or move, which, if you think about it, is terrifying. Another thing that happened to both of them was that their blankets were pulled off while they were sleeping. My sister had this happen multiple times, but my mom only had it happen once. Now that you know the background, I'll tell you about the event that made me a believer. On a Saturday, my mom had taken my sister to her swimming lessons. I was home alone in my room playing online games with a friend. After we logged off, I said goodbye on the call, shut down my computer, and flopped onto my bed. I opened up YouTube to watch a new video by my favorite content creator. As I lay there, I began to hear noises coming from the kitchen. It sounded like someone was moving dishes in the sink. This struck me as odd because I was alone in the house. I paused, listening closely. Soon I heard what sounded like cabinets opening and closing. Being a bit naive, I assumed my mom and sister must have returned early. I walked down the hallway to check, but to my shock it wasn't them, and instead, at the far end of the hall leading to the kitchen, I saw a shadowy figure, like a dark misty outline of a person. I froze, completely stunned. I couldn't wrap my head around what I was seeing. After what felt like forever, I bolted back to my room and slammed the door shut. I pressed my body against it, trying to keep it closed even though nothing was chasing me. My phone was on the bed, so I slid over to grab it and texted my mom asking her what to do. She told me to leave the house immediately and go to a friend's place until she got home. I peeked out the door and down the hall. The coast was clear. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed my skateboard, ran down the hall, and hurried out the front door. I stopped at the end of the driveway to grab my shoes, and then I hopped on my skateboard and took off, almost losing my balance a few times. When I arrived at my friend's house, I told him what I had seen, and to my surprise, he believed me. He told me that once, when he was staying at my place, he had woken up in the middle of the night while sleeping on the couch in the living room, which was right next to the kitchen. He claimed to have seen a dark figure standing there, staring down the hall toward the bedrooms. At the time, he thought it was a dream because he was half asleep, so he never mentioned it. We carefully returned inside the house to investigate when my mother and sister arrived home. Disturbed dishes were out of place and the cabinets were all hanging open. None of us wanted to stay there that night, so we went to our aunt's house, which was about 20 minutes away. The next day when we returned, everything in the house was back to normal except for one strange thing: all the lights were on. Since then, I've been a firm believer in ghosts and the supernatural. This just happened about an hour ago and I'm still shaken up. My close friend and I were at home by ourselves as we had been For a while, every time he visits, we go to the forest near my house, and usually nothing exciting happens. We toss rocks, snap some twigs, just innocent fun. But this time it was different. We headed outside towards the forest, and the walk there was uneventful. But as soon as we arrived, something felt strange. The area was unusually dark, and many trees were knocked down. It didn't look like the place I remembered. Despite this, we continued on messing around as usual. At some point, my friend turned to me and suggested we should head back. I glanced at my phone to check the time. It had only been half an hour since we arrived. I wanted to stay longer since we still had hours before anyone would expect us home, so we pressed on exploring further. Along the way, we found out things: a crushed soda can that looked like it was from the 90s, and an old wee toy booth that seemed even older. We decided to go deeper into the woods than we ever had before, which wasn't saying much since we'd never ventured far after While we reached a spot I recognized, it marked the farthest I'd ever gone in the forest. It was a makeshift bridge formed by a fallen tree over a stream. I'd seen it before, but this time something was different. Perched on the bridge was a small object. As we got closer, I realized it was an animal skull. It was clean and bright white, a deer skull sitting there like it had been placed intentionally. I had no idea who could have put it there, or what happened to the rest of the deer. Across the stream was a steep hill, and at the top of it sat an eerie little cabin. While we were looking around, a faint creaking noise or high-pitched sound came from the direction of the cabin. Startled us, and we bolted. My friend screamed as we ran, but I didn't stop to ask why. We didn't slow down until we reached the edge of the forest and stepped onto the pavement. Catching our breath, I asked him why he screamed. He said he heard footsteps right next to him. When we finally got back to my house, we noticed the garage door was open. Unsure if we had left it that way or if someone else had opened it. We ran inside and locked the door. I checked the house and turned on the alarm system. Still alone, I wished my family would come back soon. Now we're sitting here nearly 2 hours later, and the unsettling feeling from those creepy woods hasn't left me. I was at home one evening by myself. My family had gone to watch my sister's soccer match, so I decided to stay home and play computer games instead. Then, I heard a soft tapping on the front door, which was strange because we had a doorbell. I thought it might just be someone mistaking our house for someone else's, but then I heard a knock on the back door as well. I cautiously made my way downstairs, peeking through the window near the front door, but I saw nothing walking toward the back of the house. I froze when I got to the back door, where a man in his 50s with a scruffy gray beard and a plaid jacket was standing on the porch. He tried to get me to open the door, but something about his eyes made my stomach turn. I refused, and he yelled, "I know you're in there by yourself." As his efforts to break in became noisier, I heard the door frame cracking as he banged at it with shaking hands. Panic struck as he began hammering on the door, trying to force his way inside. Terrified, I ran upstairs and locked myself in my mom's office. I then grabbed the phone and rang 911. The man's pounding persisted until I eventually heard the far-off wail of sirens, and when the police arrived, the man had already left. My family returned soon after, clearly shaken by what I had told them, and they were relieved that I was unharmed but terrified of what might have happened. The police apprehended the man the following day, and that night I couldn't sleep because every little sound in the house made my heart race. I kept replaying the incident, wondering why the stranger had picked our house. The police said he was just a drifter who had chosen our house at random, but I didn't feel comfortable with that explanation. The following day, I began looking for answers. I learned that the man had a history of minor offenses and some serious charges. Something about this attack felt personal, so I looked online for any possible family connection. Eventually, I came across an old news article about an armed robbery at a local store a few blocks from our house, where the man had been arrested for threatening the cashier with a weapon. I was shocked to learn that my dad had witnessed the robbery, and I realized that the man had probably targeted our home out of retaliation. The police were shocked, but they promised to provide additional security even though the man was in custody. My family was shaken by the experience, so we put up a security system, began carrying pepper spray, and were more wary about allowing strangers inside. I even downloaded a safety app on my phone that included a panic button. I was disturbed for weeks after the occurrence. I had trouble sleeping and kept checking the locks before going to bed. My parents told me we were safe. Months have gone by since that night, and although the fear has subsided, it hasn't completely gone away. The experience taught me to always be on guard and follow my instincts. When I was 11 years old, I was staying alone in our small suburban house for the night while my parents were away visiting relatives. I begged them to let me stay behind, promising to follow all the rules and act responsibly. As the hours went by, though, I began to regret my decision. The wind was roaring outside, and the windows were being battered by heavy rain. To divert my attention, I turned on the television, but during every commercial break, I heard strange noises coming from outside. I kept telling myself that it was just the storm, but an unsettling feeling crept over me, telling me that someone or something was watching me and that it would be better for me to sleep through the storm. I turned off the TV and went to bed early. I pulled the blankets up to my chin in an attempt to reassure myself that I was safe, but as I lay there in the dark, I began to hear faint footsteps and murmurs. I told myself that nothing was amiss, but I couldn't get rid of the dread that was growing inside of me. I was positive that someone was in the house right outside my bedroom door. I lay still, my breath short, my heart racing. Paralyzed by fear, then just as I felt sleep tugging at my eyelids, a noise jolted me awake. It was the unmistakable sound of the doorknob rattling. My body froze as the knob turned slowly and the door creaked open. I clenched my eyes shut, thinking if I didn't look it couldn't see me, but then I heard it measured, deliberate footsteps coming closer and closer to my bed. My fear finally boiled over. I sat upright, shouting, "Who's there?" The footsteps halted. A heavy silence hung in the air before the door slammed shut with a loud thud. Shaking, I stayed in bed for what felt like hours, too terrified to investigate. When morning finally came, I told my parents everything: the noises, the footsteps, the door. They laughed, dismissing it as my imagination running wild and blaming the storm for the creaking sounds. But I knew what I had heard. Someone or something had been in the house that night. From that moment, I never felt truly alone. Even in daylight, I would catch faint noises or see fleeting shadows out of the corner of my eye. I never found out who or what had visited me that night, and while everyone insisted it was all in my head, I know the truth. Something had been there watching me in the dark. I grew up in a quiet suburban area where the streets were lined with similar houses, each boasting neatly trimmed lawns and wooden fences. One evening, while I was sitting alone at home, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Jack was there with two older boys I had never seen before. They introduced themselves as Mike and Ethan, and although I felt a little uneasy, I invited them in because I wanted to appear cool in front of Jack's new friends. Jack was my closest friend. He was a boy who lived a few houses away, had a knack for starting trouble, and always seemed to have a new scheme. Mike and Ethan settled in right away. They stretched out on the couch and dug through the kitchen for snacks. I tried to strike up a conversation, but they were too preoccupied with their own heated argument to pay much attention. Suddenly, The room became tense as their voices became louder. Just when I thought things couldn't get much worse, Mike took out a knife, and my blood ran cold as he and Ethan started grappling on the living room floor. I saw blood, but I couldn't tell who was wounded. I was frozen in dread and didn't know how to respond. I was left to deal with the aftermath as Jack stepped in, managed to grab the knife, and helped me push them both out of the house. Neither Mike nor Ethan wanted to call for help or involve the authorities, so I scrubbed the blood off the floor and tried to put the room back in order. The thought of my parents finding out about what had happened scared me that night and taught me a hard lesson. The people you let into your life can sometimes bring unexpected danger. I made the decision to be much more cautious about who I trusted after that and never again placed myself in such a precarious position. When my parents first started letting me live alone without a sitter, I was around 11 years old. At first, it felt great to have this independence, but one night, while they were out, I was watching TV in the family room when the phone rang. I answered, but there was only silence. I hung up, and then the doorbell rang, feeling uneasy. I walked slowly to the door, not intending to open it, just to see who was there. When I peeked out, there was no one there, and then I heard glass break in the back of the house. I froze in horror, and as soon as I could, I ran out the front door and ran down the street to a neighbor's house. From there, I called my parents, who immediately called the police. Officers were already inspecting the house when my parents got there, claiming that someone had broken in and stolen several of our possessions. They assumed the intruder had been monitoring and knew I had been home alone for weeks. Even though my parents assured me that I was safe, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched every time the phone rang or someone knocked on the door. I also started having nightmares about that night and woke up soaked in sweat. One day, my parents received a call from the police saying that they had apprehended the burglar. It turned out that he had been watching the area and had noticed when my parents left knowing I was alone, so he chose to act. I was extremely relieved to learn that he had been apprehended, but the fear didn't immediately go away. For the next year, my parents resumed hiring a babysitter whenever they went out, but I never let my guard down again. While growing up in a small town where break-ins were practically unheard of, I put my dog on a leash in the backyard to let him roam and do his thing. Later, I went back inside and sat on the carpet in the living room watching TV when a commercial break started. Suddenly, I noticed a large figure behind me. One afternoon after school, I arrived home to find no one else there. The weather was warm with a hint of spring in the air, so I kept the main door open while keeping the screen door closed and unlocked. With my head partially turned toward the figure, I noticed in my peripheral vision that it wasn't a person but a large black animal. His breath smelled like stale cigarettes, and he started talking to me in a low, insinuating tone. I didn't like the way he looked at me, so I tried to move away, but he moved closer and reached out to touch my arm. Mr. Allen, one of the only people I knew in the building, noticed what was going on and moved in front of me to protect me from the strange man. Mr. Allen stayed with me, telling me that everything would be okay. He explained that the fire was probably a false alarm and that we would be back in the building soon. But I was still terrified and shaken, not knowing how I was going to survive the rest of the night. As the minutes went by, the situation started to calm down, and the firefighters finally gave the all clear, and to my surprise, there was no fire. I was relieved to see my parents when they got home, and I realized how fortunate I was to have Mr. Allen there to support me. It was like having a guardian angel watching over me and keeping me safe. I never really understood the value of having good neighbors and a sense of community, especially in an urban setting. I still think about that odd man who tried to entice me to leave the group, and I've never seen him again. A long time ago, when I was still in primary school, I believe I was around 12 years old. It was summer vacation and I was at home with my older brother. Our parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving us alone, and we were thrilled to have the house to ourselves and enjoy a sense of freedom that kids my age don't often experience. I'm pretty sure he didn't live in the building. He must have just been some creep who saw an opportunity and went for it. It served as a sobering reminder that dangerous people do exist and that we must be on guard. My brother, who was a few years older, was a bit too cool to spend time with his younger sister. He made plans to meet up with his friends at the park. Even though he was supposed to stay with me, I was a little disappointed he was leaving, but I understood he wanted to spend time with his friends. After he left, I settled down on the couch and watched some TV. The hours passed quickly, and before I knew it was getting dark outside. I got up and walked to the bathroom. As I was walking down the hall, I heard a loud noise from the living room, like the door had been opened. I thought my brother might have come back early, so I walked over to see him. When I turned the corner into the living room, I almost fainted. It wasn't my brother at all. It was one of his friends, Jim, who I knew as a real creep. I had issues with him before, and other girls in the neighborhood had complained about him too. My heart raced as I tried to stay calm and think of what to do. I quickly locked myself in the bathroom. While inside, I could hear someone moving around in the house. I heard footsteps down the hallway and then a knock on the bathroom door. I was so terrified that I was unable to react when I heard someone say, "Hey, it's me, Jim. I just wanted to talk to you. Come on, we can hang out." I knew this guy was trouble because he had a reputation for being creepy and getting into trouble, but I never expected him to break into our house. I remained silent and prayed that he would leave, but he persisted in knocking until my voice gave out. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, I heard a police car approaching, and Jim must have heard it too, because he fled right away. He probably thought I had my phone with me, but I had left it out in the living room. I cautiously exited the bathroom and opened the door to speak with the police. They searched the entire house and found no one, which didn't surprise me. They told me that a neighbor had heard me yelling and had called the police. I never found out who it was, but I wanted to express my gratitude to them for their assistance. I was also upset with my brother because I thought he knew how dangerous Jim was, but he still left me alone. I couldn't believe he had done that. I assumed Jim was at the park while my brother was with his friends, and when he heard that I was home alone, he must have snuck away and done what he did. When my parents returned, they were shocked to learn what had happened and were furious with my brother, making sure he understood how serious the situation was. They also took extra precautions to make sure our home was secure and safe. After that, I never fully trusted my brother's judgment again. I knew he could be reckless and didn't always think things through. The really frustrating part was that Jim played the whole situation off like he was invited. Since he was a friend of my brother's, he said he was just waiting there. It became my word against his, and he never faced any legal consequences for what he did. My parents did ban him from our house, though this was over 10 years ago, and of course I did eventually forgive my Brother, he was genuinely remorseful and technically no harm was done, though it was really close. My name is Sarah, and this happened when I was in the 10th grade. I got home from school around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, knowing it would be at least an hour before my parents came back from work. Usually I spent that time either watching TV or working on some assignments, but that day felt different. The moment I stepped inside, I had the strange sense that someone else was in the house. At first it was just an eerie feeling, a sense of someone's presence. Then I began hearing sounds coming from upstairs. At first I thought it might just be the wind rattling the windows or the old floorboards creaking, but when I listened more carefully, I realized they were footsteps. Someone was walking around upstairs. My mind immediately jumped to the worst possibilities. Could someone have broken in? Were they trying to rob us? Or worse, I tiptoed to the base of the staircase and glanced upwards. Standing at the top was the silhouette of a man staring down at me. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could tell he was tall and broad-shouldered. He wore a dark jacket, black jeans, and heavy work boots. My heart was pounding as I tried to figure out what to do. I felt frozen, not able to move. My legs shook so violently that I fell as I attempted to back away, even though the front door was just a few feet away. That's when the guy began coming down the stairs toward me. My legs finally moved. Instinct took over, and I ran across the yard to my neighbor's house. Mrs. Carter was a kind elderly woman who had lived next door for as long as I could remember. I knocked on her door, and when she opened it, her eyes widened in shock. I stammered out what had happened, and she quickly dragged me inside. We sat in her living room, and she gave me a glass of water while I tried to calm down. A short while later, I heard a car screeching away from my house. I assumed the man had left, but the possibility that he might come back frightened me. Mrs. Carter reassured me that everything would be all right, so she called the police, who came in a matter of minutes. They searched the house, but they couldn't find the intruder, so he left. Later, we found that some of my mom's necklaces and a few other valuables had been taken, totaling less than $800. Maybe my escape scared him away before he could take more, but for weeks after that, the man was never apprehended. I was too scared to be in the house alone, so I kept the lights on at night and was always watching over my shoulder. Eventually, the fear subsided and my life returned to normal, but I will never forget that day because I often wondered what might have happened if I hadn't run when I did. It was a close call, and I'm glad I was able to escape in time. One evening when I was 12 years old, in the early 1990s, I was watching TV at home when someone knocked. It was dark outside, and I couldn't see who it was through the peephole, so it was obvious to whoever was outside that someone was home. My parents had always warned me to be wary of strangers and to never let anyone in when they weren't there, so I was apprehensive. I opened the door just enough to see a man who appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s. He was courteous as he stated that he needed to contact for assistance since his automobile had broken down. I was hesitant since my parents had always cautioned me about such circumstances, but I didn't want to turn him away if he really needed assistance. I asked where his car was and he pointed down the street, but when I looked I couldn't see any vehicle. I also found it strange that he had passed the two houses next to mine, both of which had cars in their driveways. It made me think he chose my house because it might look like no adults were home. When I mentioned this, the man became irritated and defensive, which made me even more uneasy. We went back and forth for a while. He insisted he needed to use the phone, but I suggested he try one of the neighbors instead. Finally, I decided the best thing to do was to close the door and lock it. As I shut the door, the man began yelling and cursing at me, calling me all sorts of names. Remember, I was only 12 at the time. I stood firm and refused to let him in. It was an obvious choice. At that point, I heard him stomping away, still shouting angrily, and felt a wave of relief that the encounter was over. I went around the house and double-checked that all the doors were locked, though I was pretty sure they already were. A few minutes later, I called my parents to tell them what had happened. They were worried and told me to stay inside and keep everything locked, which I assured them I had already done. I sat nervously on the couch waiting for them to come home. Thankfully, nothing else happened that night. When my parents returned, I was incredibly relieved not to be alone anymore. The next day, they spoke with several of our nearby neighbors, but none of them had seen the man or had a knock on their doors. My dad thought the man might have been scoping out the neighborhood to see which houses were easiest to break into. At the time, all the other houses near us had cars in their driveways, which could explain why he chose ours. In the days that followed, we noticed a suspicious car driving around the neighborhood. I never got a good look at it, so I couldn't tell if it was the same man, but it seemed like it could be connected. My parents reported the incident to the police, but nothing ever came of it. We never saw that man again, and life eventually returned to normal. However, a few weeks later, one of our neighbors, an older couple, was robbed. While we couldn't know for sure, I've always believed the two incidents were related.